We all love Monsters, Inc. It has an incredible soundtrack, amazing performances from Billy Crystal and John Goodman, subversive monster world building, genuinely funny humour, and a heartwarming story.
Now I'm going to ruin it by showing you how it forgives and promotes the worst aspects of neoliberal petrocapitalism. Fix your butthole.
Neoliberal petrocapitalism are two terms that sound confusing, but they're not really, so let's break it down and go through them. Neoliberal refers to the dominant ideology of so-called Western societies, though we can safely include Japan here, that values individualism, entrepreneurship, the free market, as well as more classically liberal ideals such as constitutional democracy and a degree of social liberty. Though who is granted these liberties often depends on who counts as a person.
Il est écrit ici, tout clair, que c'est la Déclaration des droits de l'homme. Pas les femmes, ni les pauvres, et certainement pas les esclaves. Petrocapitalism describes our current global economic system in which we have the mass circulation and exchange of money and commodities. This circulation is made possible in our current era due to the abundance of oil. The oil part is really key to late capitalism's operations. The fact that it exists in liquid form means it is much easier and faster to transport than previous forms of energy. For instance, coal needed to be transported via trains, and so railway lines needed to be already established to move it around. In contrast, oil is more flexible. Ships carrying oil can easily change routes at any given moment, meaning it could be sent off without rigid planning and still ensure profit.
There's also the fact that oil is an incredibly powerful energy source. It is literally millions of years of pressure and heat applied to fossilized remains combusted all at once. Oil and its byproducts either power or make up most things in our lives. In the late 20th century, oil seemed like an inexhaustible resource, and it is the very thing that has created such an interconnected global network of economic exchanges that we see today.
What does this have to do with Monsters, Inc.? Oil is the kind of thing that's so ubiquitous in our lives that it goes pretty much unnoticed, and only recently has there been a move to read oil or read energy in books and films. It's so abundant and we keep relying on it so heavily to build more and more that most films that imagine future or alternative worlds also build things to be bigger and better.
Retro sci-fi aesthetics often depict huge skyscrapers, bright lights, and flying cars, and things whirring around at high speed about the cityscape. And it is no coincidence that these kinds of aesthetics emerged at a time when oil was beginning to become massively abundant, in the 50s in the US in particular.
Where fictional worlds build more, we call this in the energy humanities the fiction of surplus. This is a narrative that has arisen at a specific moment in human history where we have lots of oil. To apply that to future worlds, however, is misleading. Oil is a finite resource, and the amount of ecological destruction it's causing is reason enough to stop using it before we run out anyway. Not a lot of art has addressed this fiction of surplus. In sci-fi worlds, for example, it's not always clear where all this energy comes from, if not oil, and the gap is usually filled by a vague gesture towards technological advances that somehow produce clean energy.
And yet, Monsters, Inc. is incisive in a different way because it is a film fundamentally about energy and the conflicts that arise from the ethics of its extraction. This already makes it a fascinating film in itself to bring in some of the key ideas around reading energy in a text. To help us understand what's going on in the film, I'm going to use Naomi Klein's definition of extractivism. She calls it a non-reciprocal dominance-based relationship with the earth, one of pure taking. It is also the reduction of life into objects for the use of others, and human beings into labour to be brutally extracted.
So we have two key parts to extractivism here, a non-reciprocal relationship based on dominance and taking, as well as the reduction of life into objects or labour to be extracted. This is consistent with neoliberal thinking because, as we saw with classical liberalism, if you view certain living things as objects and not subjects, then you will fail to grant those living things rights. This is exactly how the corporation Monsters, Inc. treats children at the beginning of the film.
We see monsters enter the human world, brutally exploiting children by making them scream and harvesting those screams as energy. We see the opening of the film reenact the monster under the bed trope, which a child audience in particular would intuitively understand as terrifying. Of course, this fear is undercut by a comic subversion in which the monster worker turns out to be more afraid of the child than vice versa, as well as the fact the child is actually a testing dummy. You don't want your child audience to be too terrified to watch, after all. But it's clear what the monsters are doing is ethically very questionable, and this becomes more apparent as Sully develops a bond with Boo over the course of the movie. He is forced to confront how he affects the children he scares. This reaches its tensest narrative peak when Sully, being a top worker at the plant, is forced to demonstrate his scaring skills to his boss with Boo in the room. It is here we get the rawest moment of the children's fear, the scene being dimly lit, a close-up of Sully's roaring face spliced with images of Boo and the dummy crying and trembling, and the roar goes on quite a while. The fear Sully causes emotionally and visually calls into question the plant's exploitative practices. The most interesting criticism the movie provides of this exploitative method of energy extraction is the corporate sheen and justifications Monster Incorporated put forward in their own advertising. In contrast to what we see from Sully's perspective, the terrified, shaking bodies of exploited children, the advertisement employs deliberate editing to reduce the children's screams to sound bites, and positions the camera to focus on Sully's scaring prowess and away from the terrified children. But on top of that, the ad itself is rich with bright, warm imagery that presents Monsters Incorporated as both comforting and necessary. As the narrator's deep fatherly voice reminds viewers,
"We power your car, we warm your home, we light your city."
We are presented with images of family life, of a monster going to work, and a mother monster reading to her child in the warm glow of a room. The idea that energy can be sold to us as comfort, as something that can evoke powerful feelings and not just mere logistics, is pretty fascinating. This homely perspective then zooms out towards a bright cityscape complete with skyscrapers, fully lit at night, aesthetically reminiscent of New York and its reputation as the city that never sleeps. Comfort turns into awe at the amount of energy available to us and the kind of vast, bright, almost supernatural aesthetics it allows.
Energy, then, is sold not just as something we need to live, but what a critic like Matthew Huber would call the good life, in which the fact of energy abundance permeates its building blocks at every stage. This idea of the good life, as Huber notes, is entrenched in neoliberal thinking because it values freedom from limit, even nature's limits. This immoderate lifestyle, where we can expend energy freely and unthinkingly at any point during our day, is presented as the standard rather than unsustainable or luxurious.
The reason I'm spending so much time talking about this advertisement is that although it's for a fictional energy corporation, which uses a fictional kind of energy source, it replicates the exact same marketing strategies as private companies selling petroleum in the US. In an ad for Shell from 1956, it puts forward an A to Z of the good things about petroleum. This particular image shows H for home and emphasizes comforting words like heart and harmony. The ad then goes on to show how oil is necessary to regulate these things. For instance, in the heart section, it mentions heart medication, whose production relies on oil. Throughout the 50s, Essos's tagline was, "Petroleum helps build a better life."
These ads pull together the paradox of luxury and necessity, since they demonstrate how oil is everywhere. It heats up your nice home, and it's in lots of products that make your life easier. Oh, and by the way, it's in your heart medication which you need to live. What these companies have in common with Monsters Incorporated, then, is that they both tout the unavoidability of using that particular energy source as life's building blocks, despite the luxurious lifestyles they build. The sense of necessity and unavoidability in turn justifies the exploitation that extractivism relies upon, while the attempt at comfort sanitizes the cruelty involved. But, as viewers of Monsters, Inc., we've seen how scared the children are. We know the ad is lying to us.
As a crescendo of the ad's parodic power, we hear at the end the corporation's slogan, trademarked for heightened insincerity.
We scare because we care.
The whole ad is a transparent attempt to recenter extractivism as caring rather than exploitative, using manipulative marketing strategies and editing to reconcile the contradictions of luxury and necessity, of caring and scaring. The film is really intriguing for the way it juxtaposes the corporate sheen which sanitizes this exploitation with what we see and know about the children and how scared they are. The connections to petroleum and US marketing strategies as well make it a fascinating text for thinking about critiques of oil and its extraction.
However, the way the film chooses to solve this problem of exploitation is, well, questionable. Remember the ad's similarities to oil, because that's going to be important.
The critiques Monsters, Inc. puts forward of neoliberal ideas about energy and extractivism really stop at the ad, and from there most things are set in place to provide an opportunity for extractivism to be redeemed. Boo and Sully's relationship, for instance, makes Sully care about the children he scares, but more importantly for the plot and the monster world's impending energy crisis, it allows him and Mike to figure out that laughter is a more powerful energy source than screams. Basically, the monsters have to sacrifice nothing, nor have to change a fundamentally exploitative system of extraction for the movie to resolve its problems and tensions. If anything, their discovery leads to even more energy, more celebration, more luxury, and more success. Sully is appointed as new CEO for his breakthrough, which feels appropriate since he was the hardest worker at the plant, but is also a neoliberal fantasy of meritocracy's realness. But more importantly than that, the movie has not resolved the fact that the corporation is continuing to treat the children as things to be extracted. Furthermore, rather than recognizing that there are limits to a reasonable level of energy consumption, we see Sully holding a graph that shows an exponential increase in energy, trending towards infinity. The movie's joyous atmosphere and the final transition to Mike and Sully's duet of Randy Newman's jazzy and light-hearted "Wouldn't Have Nothing If I Didn't Have You" is really just a celebration that the fiction of surplus has been restored.
But as we saw earlier, this is a fiction fueled mostly by a historically specific moment in time, where we have an abundance of oil. There is no reason to believe this will always be the case. Oil is a finite resource and is necessarily limited anyway because of the massive amounts of ecological destruction it causes. And you might say to me, but this movie isn't about oil, they extract children's laughter. But the monster world is not entirely unrelated to our own. We saw how the Monster Incorporated ad parallels marketing strategies used by petroleum companies. But even further, parts of the film have what we call in the energy humanities petroaesthetics.
What I mean by that in this film is that Mike and Sully's neighbourhood looks very much like 1950s New York, a city whose aesthetics reflect and are made possible by oil abundance. The streets are lined with cars, lampposts, impossibly tall apartment blocks, and there are miles and miles of interconnected roads. Have you ever wondered why Mike has a boisterous Bronx accent?
Dodgeball was the best. Oh, yeah. I was the fastest one out there. Of course, I was the ball.
I'm just a punky little eyeball and a funky optic nerve.
or why the intro is so jazzy and pulls heavily from a 50s New York art movement called abstract expressionism. These are all nostalgic impulses towards the 50s, a time in US history where they were able to get their hands on huge amounts of oil. Of course, all this nostalgia obscures the unethical ways in which they were able to do so.
The 50s in many ways represents a turning point for US oil because Saudi and Venezuelan sources for a moment seemed unreliable. But the US, through imperial force, were able to secure that oil for themselves.
In February 1948, Venezuela democratically elected a president who promised to increase state tax revenue for the country's oil profits, a move which threatened private US interests. By November of the same year, the US had installed a military dictatorship who, along with executing political opponents, allowed American oil companies, like Essos, whose ad we saw earlier, to run rampant. This in turn provided millions of mostly white Americans the middle-class suburban lifestyle so characteristic of that era. And yes, it is that racialized and unequal. Diane de Prima was a beat poet and second-generation Italian immigrant who came of age in 50s New York, and she details in her memoir having to spend hours every day gathering discarded furniture to burn in her fireplace to warm her dilapidated Manhattan apartment. Conversely, think of all the things you need to have that suburban life. You need 1 to 2 cars per family, an assortment of white goods whose manufacturing and transport relies on oil, roads that connect the suburbs to cities, places of work, shopping centres, tarmac roads of course being made of oil and its byproducts. It is a lifestyle slick with oil.
I would like to add here that it's very easy at this point to feel guilty as an individual for driving a car or using petroleum-based products. But I want us to think more broadly about the culture that expects people to drive, the lifestyles in which oil is such a key component, and how this is necessarily at the expense of not only other people, but our wider ecology. This last part is something energy companies deliberately obscure to make you more comfortable using their products. But rather than think of ourselves as individuals, it is helpful in this context to reconfigure ourselves as part of a much larger network. This allows us to tackle fossil fuel usage on a systemic level, and allows us to understand it as a cultural phenomenon more than a series of individual choices. At worst, individualism benefits neoliberal petrocapitalism because questions of ecological responsibility feel unrelated or unimportant to your sense of freedom. At best, individualism makes you feel personally responsible and guilty for decisions you were encouraged to make, and places too huge a burden on you to deal with alone. In future videos, I hope to further explore what it means to reconfigure ourselves in the world beyond the individual, but for now just remember not to focus on feeling guilty.
This 50s nostalgia we see in Monsters, Inc., expressed in its petro-aesthetics, blends seamlessly with the more noughties aesthetics of the power plant. And there's a reason these 2 decades aesthetics blend so easily in this movie, because the late 90s and early noughties were another moment of oil-fueled prosperity. Coincidentally, the early noughties was also another peak moment for neoliberalism. Francis Fukuyama, CEO of Toyota car manufacturing, published a book called The End of History and the Last Man. This coincided with lots of car companies in the West, plus Japan, adopting just-in-time production rather than just-in-case. What this signals about the noughties was that manufacturers had faith they could fulfill requests on demand rather than manufacturing in advance, should access to oil prove difficult.
That's what the film feels like, a kind of end of history. We have a graph accelerating to infinity, joyous celebration, and a seemingly permanent solution to the energy crisis, as well as aesthetic and sonic practices from different oil-abundant decades harmoniously interwoven into the monster world, and which have no consideration for the vast inequalities that existed in 50s America and which still exist today. There is no awareness that we are currently in peak oil, that those who reap its benefits are a minority, and even if that were not the case, oil extraction cannot last forever.
Now, I've seen leftist critiques of this movie that are along the lines of there is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. And maybe you're not a there's no such thing as ethical capitalism kind of person.
But the parallels to our petrocapitalist world, the petro-aesthetics, the neoliberal failure to imagine limits, all show how Monsters, Inc. fails to challenge the key ethical issues around extractivism and capitalist logics of endless growth. In reality, oil is not suddenly going to become cleaner, more abundant, more ethical. In the same way the monsters have failed to grant rights to the children they extract from, so too have we failed to grant rights to the living ecosystems where we extract oil. This is also why so-called renewable energy also has similar problems.
Solar panels are surprisingly short-lived, needing replaced every 30 years. They also need lithium batteries to operate, whose construction relies on dangerous cobalt mines, some of which use child labour, and whose extraction pollutes the environment in a similar fashion, if not extent, to oil.
Same goes for uranium, by the way. A more helpful way of thinking about energy futures is to tackle narratives of endless growth, of energy expenditure without limit or responsibility. Realistically, we may need to lead more humble lives. We may need to imagine a world where not everyone owns a car and drives to work, cities that have far less lighting at night, though enough for safety. Maybe you won't be able to run your kettle and your washing machine at the same time. These are things that are such a given in the fictional worlds we create that problems of extraction and exploitation are literally fantasized away by limitless energy sources. So despite being pretty compelling as an energy text, Monsters, Inc. indulges in neoliberal petrocapitalism's worst fantasies. What at first appears to be a critique of energy commodification collapses into the American cliché that a single worker's innovation and pioneering spirit will sufficiently resolve any crisis, and the capitalist system that promotes a fundamentally imperial relationship to the children in the human world remains unchanged. It is still a banging movie though, with a great soundtrack, so don't feel too bad for enjoying it.
Join me next time where I explore extractivism in another, very different movie.
Wouldn't have nothing if I didn't have you. Wouldn't have nothing if I didn't have. Wouldn't have.
One more time!